that when we get people right, we get business right. So I'd like to welcome you back to a revamped podcast with shorter episodes that focus on 3 areas that I specialise in: leadership, performance, and culture. You'll hear my guests talking about their experiences and expertise, and we'll be providing thought-provoking insights around putting the human factor back into business. Each conversation will be accompanied by a free downloadable guide to save the strain on your memory and resources that will make it easier to put the great ideas we discuss into action. I'm your host, Lisa, psychologist, psychotherapist, and founder of It's Time for Change, and I thrive on conversations that make a difference. So reach out to me. My details are in the show notes along with the resources. So grab a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Welcome to Beyond the Water Cooler. As we wrap up this year, I want to give you something really practical and forward-looking to take into the new year. This is the perfect moment to pause, reflect, and think about how we lead differently in 2026. The world of work continues to shift. Expectations have changed, people have changed, and organisations are still finding their feet in what is now our new normal. In my work this year, supporting leaders, managers, and teams across a whole range of organisations, I've noticed the same patterns showing up again and again. And we're seeing these reflected in the most recent research too. So today, I'm sharing the 5 people challenges leaders simply can't ignore as we head into 2026. These challenges sit right at the intersection of performance, culture, and well-being. And addressing them is where the biggest gains will be made. Underpinning them all is that context really matters. And this is what I've numbered as zeros. We've got 5 more challenges to follow, but this is something that I really wanted to start with. And it's important to mention because it's why traditional ways of addressing needs no longer work. What works in one setting doesn't necessarily work in another. And what works for one individual isn't necessarily a good fit for others in a similar role. So it's not new, but it's still critical to keep front of mind. And that's personalisation. Yes, it takes more time, thought, and effort, but the benefits far outweigh the waste of not getting it right. So my advice here is to work with trusted partners who co-create development opportunities with you in an organic way. They're recognising that priorities also change and that needs should be responded to in a timely way, not as part of a scheduled programme of work that doesn't necessarily align with the reality your people are experiencing now. The last point I'll make about context is the need to focus on development activities that solve problems and improve practice, being small rather than anything really substantial and feeling overwhelming. Successful change is the opposite to big stadium transformation that quite frankly sounds risky and something we can't fit into our already overspilling workload. It needs to be as simple as possible, often easier to spot when you're not at the centre of the challenge. It needs to feel achievable and be well planned with a theoretical, research-based underpinning to guard against the latest whim or marketing campaign. It needs to be targeted and tested to be confident of impact. And this is the space in which I sit, but you may already have your trusted go-tos. And if that's the case, discuss the following challenges we're going to cover today with those people. Identify what it means for you and your organisation, and then work out your first step on what is a continual journey. If you're interested in a more behavioural science approach to test different ways of doing things, as opposed to traditional models, I'd love to talk. But for now, let's get straight into the first of the 5 people challenges you can't ignore. The first one is about emotional exhaustion masquerading as resilience. And a lot of people are functioning, or they seem to be functioning well enough right now. They're delivering, they're showing up. But underneath, the emotional reserves are low. The tank is empty. And leaders are often misreading high output as high well-being. What I'm seeing more and more is what I'd call quiet depletion. An increasingly common term is quiet cracking, the slow, invisible, emotional burnout experienced by employees who appear to be functioning well, but internally are struggling with significant stress. It shows up in different ways, but it might look like shorter tempers, decision fatigue, lower creativity, a drop in empathy, people withdrawing a little, a sense of being constantly behind. Hybrid work has hidden some of this. You can't always see the strain when people aren't in front of you every day, but it's there. And 2026 is going to expose that strain because the pace of work isn't slowing and the emotional load of the past few years hasn't magically disappeared. This matters because emotional exhaustion is the enemy of performance. When people don't have the psychological or emotional space they need, everything tightens, thinking narrows, reactions become sharper, and relationships take a hit. So, what can we do about it? Well, healthy high performance requires energy, recovery, clarity, agency, not just grit and determination. So, pacing is going to be important, doing less to achieve more, creating space to step back, evaluate, to be more strategic and far more effective in terms of impact. That requires permission and expectation, as it's about consciously moving back from being on or doing mode and actually being able to take space and do something far more important. Also, leaders need to get far better at spotting the early signs in themselves and in others. What do they look like for each individual? How are people checking in with their peers? Do people feel it's okay and expected to share concerns when changes in behaviour or those early warning signs are observed? Think about who is looking out for your leaders too. Some recent stats by DDI suggest that 71% of leaders have experienced a significant increase in stress. 54% are concerned about burnout, and 40% have considered leaving to improve well-being. Ask yourself if you know how those numbers relate to the leaders in your organisation, and then what are you going to do about it? And the critical message here is the importance of being by the side of people to know how they are doing and to actively find ways to improve employees' experience at all levels of the organisation, to challenge the acceptance of stress being a norm and to find sustainable ways for people to do their job and experience good health. The second challenge is the widening manager capability gap. Managers continue to be the biggest lever for culture and performance, and at the same time, they're the group receiving the least development. They're avoiding what's required of them. More now are resorting to low quality AI use to increase efficiency, but that creates an illusion of considered, polished outcomes, whereas in reality, they can be lacking quality and rigor. AI requires high quality human interaction, and we know that's at risk when our managers and people leaders are stressed, and then they're most likely to use it for quick wins. But that undermines trust and confidence. But I mustn't get sidetracked by AI, so I'm going to go back to how leaders are actually showing up. The gaps I'm seeing most often are giving clear feedback, having boundaries conversations, coaching rather than instructing, managing conflict, and demonstrating emotional intelligence. Avoiding hard conversations is something that nearly every leader and manager struggles with. I know because I talk to them about it. Why? Because everyone feels emotionally stretched and they don't want to upset people. They're worried about the reaction. They're tired. They don't feel confident in how to have those conversations well. But the cost of avoidance is huge. What doesn't get said creates gaps, and people fill those gaps with assumptions, usually negative ones. That's where disengagement starts. That's where resentment builds. That's where performance quietly declines. And that's where well-being erodes. So being able to communicate effectively is a must in order for managers to lead people well in today's environment. And they're the exact skills organisations are often overlooking. Managers have become the pressure point between strategy and reality. They're expected to carry the culture, support well-being, drive performance, communicate clearly, and hold everything together during change. But many simply haven't been given the capability to do that. So, what to do? This is where coaching skills become essential. The ability to ask good questions, to hold space for someone to think, to create clarity in the noise. This is what drives performance sustainably. It takes the pressure off managers having all the answers and being able to create the right environment for people to solve their own problems. I'm a fan of monthly peer reflection and development groups where employees come together to problem solve what's front of mind, to deep dive into specific challenges brought to the table, to learn a relevant new skill, and to take away practical ideas to put straight into practice because they are timely and relevant. And if you're interested in developing those, I can give you some more specific advice around how to shape those to provide most impact. Support to develop relationships and communication skills that include emotional intelligence or relational intelligence are going to open the gateway to establish clarity, trust, psychological safety, and performance. In 2026, people leaders will have to get far better at having human, grounded, skillful conversations, the kind that move people forward rather than shut them down. Traditional models of big training programs that are costly and time consuming are being replaced with far more effective programs that enable people to learn what's relevant to them at the time those skills are needed. And the emphasis is all about very small steps that are planned by being clear about the specific need, what's going to be tested, and what success will look like, the how and when the changes are going to take place, and then conscious evaluation and learning to identify what tweaks might be needed, how to make the change part of everyday practice, and if relevant, how to roll it out more widely. That's what I work with organisations to co-create programs that are organic in their design and ready to pivot when needs change. I've been known to do that in workshops before when we've parked the planned topic to address a far bigger headache that is consuming the people in the room. If you don't acknowledge the necessary change in agenda, people will not be engaged because it simply isn't as important to them at the time. When organisations get manager capability right, everything shifts. When they ignore it, culture becomes inconsistent, belonging drops, and performance becomes transactional. Challenge number 3 is culture fragmentation. And that happens when we have hybrid and multi-site teams more and more. Culture used to feel more cohesive because people were physically together. But now we're seeing multiple microcultures forming, if you like, often unintentionally. ONS data shows that hybrid working has now become the norm for roughly a quarter of workers, meaning your culture needs to travel well beyond the walls of any single workplace. And in distributed organisations where teams operate across multiple locations and time zones, company culture becomes both more challenging and more essential. Company culture, as you may well know by now, is the shared set of values, behaviours, and practices that guide how we do things around here, made visible in everyday decisions and experiences. Unless these are deliberately considered and acted on, they will drift, and an unintentional culture will fill the void. Hybrid teams, multi site teams, dispersed teams, these all create different lived experiences. And what truly shapes culture isn't the values on your organization's website, it's the everyday behaviors that people experience. The resulting fragmentation shows up as inconsistency, mixed messages, disconnection, and reduced belonging that increases isolation, disengagement, lower trust, slower collaboration. There are fewer informal touch points to share the context, notice and help each other, check out that we're still on the same page. This is where the title of this podcast, Beyond the Water Cooler, originated, from the value that happens when people are able to touch base informally. Organisational values become diluted because they are interpreted differently across teams unless they've been translated into observable behaviours and mechanisms to monitor feedback and recognise importance being placed on these. Leaders can no longer rely on proximity to shape culture. They have to design it intentionally. They need to create rituals, rhythms, behaviours that connect people, even when they're not in the same place. So, some things to try: turn your values into observable behaviours so that people are clear about what's expected, how it's rewarded, and how these are communicated through everyday practice. That requires a shift in values from being slogans to being meaningful, practical messaging that everyone understands. Leaders need to understand the influence that they have in their role modeling too, about what is and isn't okay, what's expected, what's important, and whether values make a difference. That requires a development in communication, including that relational intelligence I mentioned earlier, decision making, feedback, and recognition, and prioritizing spaciousness that allows for reflection, noticing, and checking in. Create touch points through virtual coffees, cross team introductions, weekly team shout outs, buddy systems, storytelling about how values are played out, the difference they've made. Ask your team what's meaningful to them. And where employees are hybrid working, remember the benefit of agreeing when everyone goes into the workplace that there's a clear reason for going in. You have meetings, social events, presentations, training, opportunities for mentoring. All your face to face stuff is pushed into those days. And on the other days, people can engage with quiet or deep work, reading, writing, preparing presentations, writing documents, thinking about stuff, which is that very vital and very undervalued activity that I talk a lot about. Maybe one on ones. On these days, employees are often happy to be left alone because the quality of interaction and clarity of expectations has already occurred. They feel connected to their team without being present with them. So remember that culture is built in those tiny moments that happen regardless of where you are: your tone, your response, how you handle pressure, how you run meetings, whether you follow through. All these everyday micro behaviors matter more now than ever. Self awareness is an absolute critical key skill that people need to spend time getting familiar with and getting better at. Number 4 on my list is Banny, which actually is the nickname of a friend of mine. But in this context, I'm talking about something quite different. The world we live in now is very different to the world not so long ago, and we must acknowledge how tough it feels. This underpins the need to be human at work, consciously moving towards people being able to be honest about how hard things feel, to connect with peers, to share challenges, and to co develop ways to move forward. Many of you will have heard of VUCA, a concept developed in the 1980s referring to the world being volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It was based on problems being linear. A specific cause leads to a predictable effect. But more recently, in 2018, a new model called BANI was developed that feels more aligned with what we're experiencing today. The B is for brittle. A system might look strong on the surface, but can break very suddenly and completely. Take the COVID-19 pandemic, when things that were stable, efficient, predictable were suddenly completely disrupted within days. The A is for anxious. That feeling of helplessness and feeling that something bad could happen reduces our ability to think clearly, to make good decisions, and it drains our energy and concentration. We're really sensitive to non-stop commentary about bad things around the world that are outside our control. The N is for non-linear. Cause and effect are not connected simply. A small action can trigger a huge unexpected result. For example, imagine one wrong word by a leader. Conversely, a massive effort can lead to minimal change. For example, when people I know spend hours trying to hack social media algorithms to little effect, which is why I don't bother. The I in Banny is incomprehensible. Our world is still confusing despite so much analysis and data. We don't know what is important or true. Data is often contradicting, but it can offer valid opinions, and it's trying to sift through what we should be taking notice of and what we can park. Think about how Banny relates to your experience. Reflecting on the world we live in now gives us an opportunity to consider how to plan, how to be able to adapt, to be resilient, and to have empathy for complexity. So let me run through some ideas about what you can do with the guide that Banny provides. So, to survive in a brittle world, to build resilience and flexibility, practice chaos engineering. So, you test systems in a safe environment to try and break them and see how quickly you recover. So, for example, a Lego block can fall, but the structure stays standing. People also might do things like ethical hacking, which reveals weak spots to fix. So it's looking for the potential for damage to occur and making sure that your system stands up to it. To calm an anxious world, to foster empathy and trust, you focus on well-being, active listening, meaningful action to create a safe environment. You celebrate the small wins to reduce overwhelm. You delegate to increase others' autonomy so that they're in control of their own actions and to reduce your own workload. Again, there's nothing new here, but it's thinking about the importance of making it happen. The N about being non-linear. So you need to know how to navigate a non-linear world to be adaptable. Imagine 3 to 5 scenarios for forward planning and review your plans monthly. Create fast feedback loops where you test new ideas. Fail fast, learn fast is no longer for startups. But it takes effort to override the human craving for stability and predictability. So it is about a real mindset shift in terms of testing new things, expecting them to fail, and looking out for the opportunities where progress can be made. And finally, trying to gain clarity in an incomprehensible world, hold sense making sessions. Ask your team, what did we see this week? What might it mean? The goal is to build a shared understanding, not to find a perfect answer. So go back to your purpose and your core values. And also, gut feelings should be respected. Data alone is not enough. So, the final challenge is the widening gap between what leaders think is happening and what employees actually experience. Often, leaders genuinely believe that they are communicating clearly, they're being visible, they're supporting well-being, they're living the values, they're creating culture. But when you talk to people across the organisation, their experience doesn't always match. I see this gap in almost every organisation that I work with. Leaders assume something is understood, but employees are unclear. Leaders believe they're accessible, but employees feel distant from decision making. Leaders think culture is strong, but employees experience inconsistency. Leaders believe they are in control. Employees sense the stress and overwhelming burden on their leaders, and as such experience the impact on how those leaders show up. And that is far from the illusion of being in control that the leaders like to believe. This misalignment is dangerous because it leads to poor decisions abandoned initiatives, and the erosion of the culture is also adding to the increasing problem that is leadership is no longer seen as aspirational. People are favouring well-being over the stress that they see leaders experiencing constantly under a pressure that's too great for humans to live with in a healthy way. And that's only going to increase the void between leaders and their employees. So leaders need new habits, checking assumptions, asking better questions, listening deeply, really seeking to understand, closing the loop, and being radically consistent in how they show up. This is where the culture gets stuck, but it's where the leadership growth has most potential. So, keeping the 5 C's, the curiosity, clarity, creativity, connection, and conscience in mind when navigating the role of people leadership will go a long way towards building authentic and trusting relationships that underpin the most successful teams. And you need clarity about what good looks like. What are the specific behaviours you want to see more of? Think about your intentions now and interrogate them in terms of how tangible they are. Do they communicate clearly what people will be doing? What's observable? The clearer the detail and the smaller the change, the more likely it will be to be achieved. And organisations need to think carefully about how they're communicating the role of leaders, intentionally and otherwise. People see them day in, day out. You need to create a more aspirational understanding of what such a responsibility looks like. Otherwise, you can have a leadership succession problem in the future. So that's the 5 people challenges. Let's think about how to bring it all together, because the 5 of them aren't separate. They're really interconnected. Emotional exhaustion makes conversations harder. Conversations that don't happen widen the culture gap. Culture fragmentation makes manager capability even more important. And capability gaps widen the disconnect between leaders and their people. The good news is this: every single one of these challenges is an opportunity to lead differently, to communicate differently, to listen differently, to create the conditions where people thrive and where performance becomes sustainable. So as you head into 2026, reflect honestly on these 5 areas. Where are the cracks? Where are the opportunities? And where do you need to focus? Small intentional changes make the biggest difference. Thank you for joining me today and for being part of this podcast community throughout the year. If any of these challenges resonated, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me a message on LinkedIn or through my website, and let's keep the conversation going. So I wish you time to rest, reset, and reflect over the break. And remember, when people thrive, business thrives. If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, there are 3 things I invite you to do. First, click the link in the show notes to download the resources for this episode. Secondly, help me extend the reach of this podcast by leaving a quick review on Apple or wherever you listen. And please share this episode with your colleagues so that you can discuss what resonates with your team. And finally, as usual, I invite you to reach out to me on LinkedIn or through my website so that we can keep the conversation flowing. I know listeners often say they're keen to implement some of the key takeaways, but sometimes find it tough without guidance or extra support. If that's you, drop me a line and let's chat. If you're listening to this in autumn 2025, then keep them peeled for my brand spanking new website that's coming soon. Be sure to check it out. It's timeforchange.co.uk to find a whole heap more to support you to reflect on and develop your own practice. And while you're there, join my mailing list to stay up to date with bespoke support services like my new retained partnerships, where I'm by your side through all things leadership, culture, and performance. Feel free to reach out if you want to know more. I'm a great sounding board for challenges and ideas for development, so grab all the details you need from the show notes. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to the next episode coming soon. Join me then.